And I've often thought, man, I hope I never show up in a place where there's not somebody to do that. So I showed up at my last church, $2 million budget. And my entire finance committee had already left the church. And the executive pastor had retired a year before. So I'm looking at a $2 million budget, trying to figure out what in the world do we do. By the time we figured out that budget, we found out that we were actually spending about $200,000 to $300,000 a year on savings for the last multiple years. I am not gifted with budgets, but I know that's not good. And then we had to go through some layoffs. There's nothing that makes you more popular as a new pastor than laying off most staff. The challenge was, had I never developed my ability to read budgets, I wouldn't have known how to manage that situation, because I wouldn't have known what I didn't know. I was just good enough to know we were in trouble, and just good enough to begin to put it together so that I could recruit the right people to help me. And so whatever those weaknesses are, do not ignore them, but develop them. You have to develop them enough that you can at least delegate them. But if you don't have a clue what you're doing, you're going to delegate them to the wrong people, and you're not even going to know it. And that gets a lot of us in trouble. So if it's a competence issue, develop it. And then also share it. You have to tell people. So one of the greatest gifts I've got is the former DS of that district was also the pastor of that church. And so three of the four last pastors are still in that congregation. So the first thing I did as their new pastor was pull those three people together in that DS and said, hey, we're in trouble, I need your help. And those guys had lived with that budget for 25 years consecutively, and that DS had seen all the reports. They had historical information that I did not have and could not pull together quick enough. And so the fact that I shared it, now I've got 4 people helping me look at that and helping us write that ship. Had I not, we would have been in trouble. I don't think we would have survived. So you have to share it. If it's a company, it's a competence issue. If your weakness is a physical issue, I think you need to share that as well. So I'll say right now, I was born deaf. And so when I get tired, I slur. I can't hear anything on this side of the room. So you guys are free to talk, and unless I look at you, I won't have a clue what you're saying. But I also read lips pretty well. So I can hear you back there, even if you don't say it out loud. It's a weakness that I think people should know. So in a large crowd, walking through the halls of our church, and somebody says, hey, pastor, I keep walking. Because every sound comes in through this ear. I have no idea where sounds are coming from. And there's 35 retired pastors in my church, so they're probably not talking to me either. I also have glaucoma, which means that by about 9 o'clock at night, I look like I have been on a bender. I haven't been, by the way. I also get some pretty good migraines. So there was a period of time in which we had a Saturday night service at our last church. And by about noon, I couldn't drive because the glaucoma had gotten so bad that I was seeing double vision. And by about 4 o'clock, I had a migraine so bad that I could barely walk. But we had a Saturday night service, and I was a manuscript preacher. I couldn't even read the scriptures. I literally could not read the Bible. I had to confess that. And once people understood what I was struggling with, it changed everything. I will say I had a new person to our church that was so moved by my confession that they brought me a baggie of stuff afterwards that would help me. And Washington State marijuana is legal. I appreciated their heart, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with the bag. If you're wondering, I just took the operating, so the ushers had to figure it out. So if it's a physical issue, you have to learn how to cope with it, but you also need to confess it. Nobody's perfect. Nobody expects you to be perfect. If you don't have the energy to lead every meeting, confess that. It helps us ask other people help you to do that. And then the next one is relational. If it's a relational issue, I think the first thing you have to do is contextualize it. And here's why I say that. I pastored, my first church was in Idaho as a youth pastor at a charismatic Foursquare church. I went from that church to a very conservative Nazarene church. I changed because of its theology. I came into the church Nazareth. But the difference between the way I ran that youth group at that very charismatic Foursquare church, and so the first Sunday I showed up at that new church, the pastor was heading to General Assembly and said, hey, I need you to preach tonight. And I asked him, what are you talking about? Because I'd never heard of a Sunday night service before. So he told me, we have a Sunday night service. I said, well, what do you do? Didn't you do it all Sunday morning? The context was so incredibly different. When I pastored just out of Portland, that culture was very much electric cars and solar energy. When I pastored in Alaska, that was four-wheel drive trucks and guns. So the culture was incredibly different. And there were relational challenges in the way I led and the way I approached people based on the context. I think to be a good leader, you have to recognize the context and adapt to it. You cannot expect the context to adapt to you. I did not expect. So here's a quick story. I had just left Washington State as a youth pastor, went to Alaska. I was serving, this is a true story by the way. I was serving, the best ones are not true, but this is a true story. I was serving communion, and there was like 80 people. They were coming forward, and it was my wife and I, so the communion table was behind me, and we were serving by intention that Sunday. We dip it, and that was just what they did there. They were coming forward, and so body of Christ broken for you, blood of Christ shed for you, clunk, clunk. And I looked down, and somebody's 38 had fallen out of their boot holster. So what do you do? I'm from Idaho, so I knew that we couldn't leave it there. I put my foot on, I slid it back, and I kept my foot on the entire service. After the service, my church secretary came up to me and said, Pastor, I'm so sorry, it fell out of my boot. I felt terrified and gratified all at the same time. And it was my secretary. So I'm at a pastor's luncheon a couple days later, and I'm telling the story, and I'm just like, coming out of Washington, Seattle area, this was more of a rural community, so guns are, you can't be a Christian and own a gun there. You really can, but they didn't anyway. So I'm telling the story with a group of pastors, and I'm still like, I'm shocked that people were bringing a gun to church. So we're sitting in a Chinese restaurant in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm telling the story, and I'm just kind of laying on my church. That I cannot believe they did this. These pastors were looking at me like I was the biggest moron in the room. And they all leaned forward at the same time. It was like synchronized. They leaned forward and they laid their pistols on the table. Every one of them was packing. I was not going to change that context. My first pastor appreciation was about 2 months later. And at the end of the service, the usher said, Pastor, we need to stop you. Got one more thing. We had just had this beautiful communion service. I preached on reconciliation and forgiveness. The communion table, pulpit. It was a beautiful service. They invite my wife and I up, and the first thing they do is hand me a Springfield XD combat pistol. Brand new, out of the box, combat pistol. It's used for nothing other than shooting people. And then they gave me 2,000 rounds. And then they gave me a gun club membership. And then they gave my wife a gun safe. And the next year I got a rifle with a scope on. You have to understand context. I went from there to Portland area. Completely different context. What I believed did not change, but the way in which I shared dramatically did. You have to understand context, and sometimes your challenges, sometimes your weaknesses are simply a lack of understanding of context. I'm also an introvert, which matters in a church of 1,000 people, because when I preach, people feel like they know me. I'm incredibly relational when I preach. Everybody feels like they know me. There are people in my church who I don't even know their names. They sit in the back, we see 1,700 people. I can't even see, literally, I cannot see everybody. So if they come up to me after a service, and they don't get the same version of the person they've heard for 2 years on the platform, they feel like I don't like them, or I don't care about them. And I'm not cold, but it's one thing to tell 1,500 people personal things. It's a really weird thing to have 3 of them come up afterwards and start like asking really personal questions, and you don't know them at all, but they feel like they know you really well. So I've shared with my church, I'm an introvert. I love you. I love you. The 10 minutes after a service, I don't want to talk to you. Just understand, I'm completely wore out. I still talk to them, I greet them in the foyer, it's not an excuse. But there were times where, at our last church, we had 4 services. And between services, I would go and sit in the bathroom just so I could have 10 minutes to myself. I had to confess that to people. I love you. I will take any meeting with you. I will pray for you at any time. But I just have to be honest. Right after a service, right after the second service or the third service, I'm wiped out. So you invite me to lunch, I am not going to be the life of the party. I'm going to try not to drool on myself for the next 25 minutes. And they laugh, and then they invite me to lunch, and I'm trying not to drool on myself. And then the last thing I would say, if it's a relational issue, get coaching for it. Find another pastor, find another leader in your church, find somebody who has a gift that you don't, and have them coach you. So how do you do that in this community? How would you resolve this? Those kinds of questions are really important. I think a lot of our challenges in ministry they're not because of competency, they're because of relational challenges. Because if people know you love them, you'll get a lot of grace. If they don't know you love them, you won't. And so those relational issues become incredibly, incredibly important. And so in Wasilla, I grew up in Payan, Idaho. It's a hunting farming community full of Hispanics and Japanese people. The Japanese people are very quiet. They're very quiet. So the community I grew up in, during World War II, the Japanese Americans were placed in camps. Right? Are you familiar with that? After the war was over, many of those people relocated to Ontario, Oregon, and Payan, Idaho. And so that entire community was filled with those families that had been a part of that experience. And then I grew up with their kids and their grandkids, the Nisei and the Issei. That's what they call themselves. I also grew up in a community that was full of migrant workers. They were all my friends. So, because these are the people that I grew up with, that formed me in some very specific ways. 5 years ago, I was standing in Serbia on the border where the war was, and we were visiting. We planted some churches in Kosovo, and we were standing in the refugee camps in Serbia. And I remember standing there thinking, these refugee camps in Serbia are in better shape than the minor camps in America. It absolutely broke me. So I went back to the church and I asked this question: how far away do people have to live before we love them? The church was not ready to answer that question. And because of the context in which I grew up and the refugee climate right now in our state, in our country, that was a conversation that I needed to disciple people to be ready for, not one that I should have broached. Because I did not understand my context, I alienated a lot of people. It was not the wrong question to ask. It was the wrong time to ask it. And so those are really, really important conversations for us. So I'm going to stop there. That's all I have to say about weaknesses, but I do want to take questions if you have any. I think we've got about 10 minutes. You go for better. Are they all introverts still?
Can you speak to finding life balance?
No. I'm going to confess it. You know, I think that is like Bigfoot. We've all heard of it. We've never actually seen it. I don't know that. I've given up on the idea of finding life balance in perpetuity, but I think I can find it in seasons. So this last week, we did 3 funerals. I do a funeral every 7 to 10 days in our church. We've done over 250 funerals in 4 years. Literally 20% of my church has died since I've been there. It is impossible and I teach at our local college, and I said yes to this event, and I'm on the board of trustees for MTS. All of those events hit this month. There is no way for me to find balance in that. There is no secret sauce for that. But what I can do is balance it out over the next month or 2. And so I've quit trying to find balance in my week-to-week life, but trying to find it seasonally. And so there are seasons where I push really hard. And then there are seasons where I intentionally plan to not. So I think that helps me personally. A couple of things I do to help myself. I'm an achiever. It is a weakness that I have, which means I not only burn other people out, I burn myself out. And so before I say yes to anything, I ask my wife. She is amazing at helping me find balance. I think she's a little legalistic sometimes. I also do that with our church staff. How are you guys doing? Are we pushing too hard? I ask our church board that too. And so the more I live in community, the better I am at being able to give myself permission to rest over the house. You know, it's a little bit for me like, there's so many unsafe people around me. I don't want to miss a second. The flip side of that is self-care falls away really fast. And it's not sustainable for long term. So you have to deal with the crises, and I've spent the last 2-3 years dealing with the crisis. I can tell you that we don't have any major initiatives planned for our church for the next 18 months because they've already been through so many changes. And that was intentional. So one of the things I've never been, I'm not going to mess up your district, Phil. I want somebody to do this some point. So our church is 100 years old. It's 112 years old, something like that. The Bible talks about the year of Jubilee. How great would it be if every 50 years a church just said, no more ministry, we're just going to worship on Sundays, have lunch, and love each other. As a pastor, it sounds terrifying, but I wonder what would happen to the church. How much healthier our churches might be if we hit the reset button every couple of generations and quit dragging everything forward. I also think we need to take seasons of Sabbath. So I do guard my day off. I guard that. Probably because I'm an introvert and I get really cranky without it. So when I go home on Sunday or Saturday night, I get home at midnight, I'll be preaching both services, and I'm skipping Sunday night service because they don't want me there. I just know that I'm going to be really, really tired when I get back. So I try to find seasons of Sabbath, but sometimes when there's a fire, you just got to put it out. But I've learned to quit starting them. So sometimes the changes I initiate start fires. And so I don't need to start them all as quick as I do sometimes. I don't know if that helps at all, but I'm still struggling with that.
On the same vein, how do you answer somebody that tells you you need to slow down, but then in the same breath asks you to help them?
You've been to my church board meetings, right? There's an exercise I do at my board. It's not unique to me, but every year or two, when I have a new board, I'll have them. Could you do me a favor and just right where you are, list everything. I just want clear expectations and a clear covenant with our church board. So I have them list everything that they think I should be doing, and how many hours that takes. Like, how many hours a week should I spend in preaching? How many hours should I? And I have them do that. We've got 15 board members, and then we list that on the whiteboard. And it usually works out to where I need to be like the Trinity, where there's so many hours that they have expectations for that it would take for me to fulfill if I never slept. So that experience is usually really helpful because people have unrealistic and unspoken expectations. And the thing that I joke about my board is, I am so thankful that you've given me permission to not go to everything. Now you give me permission not to go to your thing. And that's just a constant tension. And I joke with them too that my goal over the next 10 years is to fill your expectations at a rate you can handle. Because it's not sustainable. It's just not sustainable. So the pastor that I followed didn't have any kids at home, and his wife stayed at home. My wife is an ordained elder, and we have 4 young kids. I literally cannot be at everything. And so just being honest about that, and honestly living with the results of disappointing people.
It's not always the ones in the church either, it's in the community.
Yeah, but they don't tithe, so I don't worry about them as well. For the community folks, if it matches the mission of our church or a personal passion, I'll say yes. But because we are a legacy church, and we've started many things in that community, and with the college that I'm on faculty at, I miss more than I'm at. And I'm just honest about it. I have 4 kids. You're not going to remember 10 years ago I was at your event or not, but my kids will. So, I stress much less about, I'm going to miss a funeral on Saturday of a 42-year-old young man who had brain cancer, and his dad's on my board. That's heartbreaking for me, right? There's just no way I can be back in time. We've already had that conversation, but the reality is I just did 3 last week too, and I can't continue the pastoral care for all of them, so in that way. All right, it's 10 o'clock, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, I hope you got something already. All right, I think you did. So we're going to take a break, and we've got all kinds of goodies out there, and when you come back in, we'll have the clipboard, we'll pass that clipboard around and she'll sign your name, and we'll cut the names and we'll have a drawing later on. Nathan is going to be speaking to us here for the second session. If you remember last year, he talked to us about taking ground back, and that has been a powerful message for us. So looking forward to the second session. So get together, spend some time, say hi to each other, check each other out, and check each other out. All right, so go. We'll see you at 10:30, okay? And we'll start right on time. 10:30.